Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I want to begin by saying that this is still very most of the time to kind of get up and do a talk this way and not be able to see the people that you're talking to or the audience. Or I always tell people, like, I've got a good solid like 10 minutes of jokes that I recycle in all my talks. And so I wait to, I've got my timing down, but you never know what's happening on Zoom. So I apologize if this feels kind of awkward. I might be like waiting for a beat, and I don't know if you're over there laughing or if you're checking your email, but either way, I'm over here like trying to make a connection, I guess, over this weird medium that we exist in right now at this point. Um, so I'll begin by saying, hey, young, Cutcha Baldy ahoye, Kinyat yan afte, kina afte, kusni afte. So I am Dr. Cutcha Baldy. I am Hupa York and Karuk. They are three tribes in very far northern California, but I'm enrolled in the Hupa Valley tribe. And I live here amongst where my people are. I'm fortunate enough to work at a university that is in the hands of the Wiyot tribe, but very near where I grew up and the people that I love and respect, and near my valley and where my river is. And right now our world is on fire, and we're actually in the midst of it. And there's a lot of fires that are surrounding us here. And so I want to think about that in terms of trying to continue on with a lot of these engagements, but also knowing that there are a lot of people in our region that just lost their homes and lost, a lot of the things that they had for their whole lives. And so when I talk to my students about, like, we keep going and we keep doing this work, part of the decolonization process is that I want to acknowledge that this is happening. And for those of us that are able to be here in this space today to start to dream together and talk about what our dreamed futures can look like, I want to acknowledge that we are all coming with those things, and that we can come together in this space to do that together. So I'm going to begin by telling you a story. So like a little while ago, I got invited to do a TED Talk, not like one of the big ones, like a local TED Talk, right? And they were like, Cutcha, we want you to come talk about decolonization, and we want you to tell us like how people can decolonize. And I had to write a draft of what I was thinking about talking about. And that was all the instructions they gave me. And at the time that I was writing the draft, California was on fire. This was like a couple years ago when California was on fire. And I was kind of ruminating on this idea that settler colonialism and the reason why California was on fire has everything to do with like what happened in history, and the fact that we don't know that we don't know that indigenous peoples were forced to stop doing their cultural burning, that they were told that that was like primitive knowledge of how you're supposed to manage spaces, that's what's causing this issue now. And so I was in a mood when I had to write back to this woman who invited me to do a talk, and she was like, just tell me what you want to talk about. And so I wrote this whole draft, and I was like, oh no, this is bad. Like, I can't send this to her. And I sent it to my friends who are my like little decolonizing activists, and they were like sitting on my shoulder like, oh, you should send that. That's really important. But I think it's important for me. I want to share what I actually wrote. I revised it for what I actually sent in, but this was my initial response when they were like, come tell us about how people can decolonize. And I'm like watching the world burn around me, and I'm thinking about all these connections. So I wrote, this is my initial draft. It's okay, it started like this. The world is on fire. It's literally on fire. This dumpster fire is a real fire. So what are you even doing here? Why did you pay money to register for this talk and come watch it? Are you going to give me your land back? Are you right now going to say, I live on stolen land, I will give it back to indigenous peoples? No, then get out of here. I don't have time to talk to you anymore. We don't have time to spend 25 minutes trying to convince each other to give stolen land back. So get out and keep your stolen land and watch the world burn to the ground. Because what usually happens is that I spend 25 minutes making you laugh and using enough scholarly buzzwords that when you climb into your Tesla later, you'll be like, she gave me a lot to think about. But there's no time to think. I'm yelling fire in a crowded building because the world is on fire. There's no time for you to consider or weigh the options or sleep on it and finally figure out that decolonization is the only thing that we can do now. Give the land back or get out of my face. If you want to decolonize, you want to change the world, you want to see what's possible, then right now, it's time to stand up. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So again, I revised it a bit before I sent it, but I was at the point where I was like, you know what happens to me a lot lately is that people want me to come and tell them about decolonization in like a nice way that also tells them that decolonization is going to be easy, but also kind of approaches them as if decolonization is an option. And it's not an option anymore because we're not going to solve the problems that we have in this world with capitalism and settler colonialism. That's what created these problems. We're only going to solve the problems and move forward through decolonization. So now is the time that we have to stand up. 20 years ago, Linda Tuhiwai Smith wrote Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous Peoples, a foundational book about decolonization. And her work told us that when stories are told about us instead of with us, then we are created in a settler imaginary that makes us less than human, less than civilized. We become only less than. These become the contested stories that then exist in curriculum, in public media, in everyday representations, in mascots, in terminology, and also in these elevated and alarming statistics that we learn about our own communities, which consistently illustrate a story about us that only defines us through trauma and genocide and the eyes of a settler desire to erase us. In 2012, Eve Tuck and Kay Wang Yang published Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. This is an article available open access through the Decolonization Journal. Tuck and Yang rightfully and righteously point out that decolonization cannot be a metaphor. It cannot be used as a replacement or in tandem with efforts to diversify. It has to be real. And real decolonization is often uncomfortable and challenging and means that you are signing up for land return, land back, and indigenous land rights and futures. So you're not decolonizing your syllabus because you add some Black, Indigenous, or people of color articles into what you teach. You're not decolonizing your bookshelf unless you're like planning to give your bookshelf back to the indigenous peoples of whose land you currently occupy. You're not decolonizing until you're actively working for land return. Decolonization cannot be a metaphor because if it's a metaphor, it creates an excuse for the hard work that needs to happen so that we can actually have just futures. It excuses people from having to do the actual work to defund the police or abolish prisons. It excuses people from having to do work to bring indigenous cultural burning back so that we're all not choking on air full of ash. It excuses people from having to stand on the front lines while we demand the prosecution of those who kill Black and brown people and those who maim Black and brown bodies through things like forced sterilization in carceral systems. So we need to know that the metaphorical decolonizing of our minds, that's not an empowerment. That doesn't help us to envision our futures. We have to start thinking about decolonization as something that we need to make happen for real. Tuck and Yang say in their article, quote, "Until stolen land is returned, critical consciousness does not translate into action that disrupts settler colonialism." So if you've never read Tuck and Yang or Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda T. Smith, you should read those. One thing that I'm always pointing out to people is that Smith's book is 20 years old. It's foundational. And if you haven't read it yet, then catch up. Because if you want to come to the talks about decolonizing things, you should already be there and do the work so that when you come here, we're able to have a real conversation. We're not just trying to teach you about what it is, but instead, and not why we should do it, but instead thinking about what can we do together. So to decolonize the curriculum for me opens up spaces for imagination and conversation and inspiration so that we can move toward land return. Now the curriculum right now is designed to limit our imagination and try to hold us into this box of like capitalism and imperialism and racism. I once heard a really good talk where the speaker said, people have an easier time imagining what they would do in a zombie apocalypse than they do to imagine the end of capitalism. And it's kind of a riff on Frederick Jameson, who said, what would we envision if we saw the end of capitalism as not the end, but instead the beginning of the world? So we have to think about like how to open up our imaginations. And a decolonized curriculum thinks about how we can start to see that a decolonized storytelling is what we need to do. And how do we empower voices who are silenced to be there to tell those stories? Because that's when you see what's possible. I know land return is possible because in our own region, we actually had land returned to the local tribe. The Wiyot people had their sacred land returned to them just last year, Tuluwat, which is the center of their world, their place of world renewal, 150 years after settlers had massacred them. During a ceremony on this island, they returned, and now the island has been returned to them. At some point, the tribal chair at the time, Cheryl Seidner, she looked and said, I'm going up and purchased like t-shirts for sale, and she talked to people and she told this story. She started to say, this is the story I want to have happen. And 25 years later, this island was returned to them. But it started with a story that began with her saying, I'm going to get our island back. That's how we decolonize the curriculum. We empower new stories. We empower imaginations beyond the settler imaginary, and we work to say it out loud for the return of Indigenous land and life. And for those of us doing this work, which I acknowledge, when I come into these spaces, I don't just want to talk to the people who aren't doing this work but are thinking about it. I also want to talk and center the people who are doing it, because we often don't get centered when we have these conversations because we're so busy educating everyone else. So for those of us already doing this, on this call, on this Zoom session, I want to say to you, I see you, and I know that decolonization is hella exhausting and takes so much out of you because a settler colonial capitalist system has been set up to drain your ability to do anything. It won't even give you the food you need to survive. It won't even give you a house to live in. It won't even give you a place where you can feel safe to drink the water. So they're trying to make it so you can't do the work all the time. And I know that that's hard, but I also want you to remind yourselves about all the times that you are together with those of us that want to dream this into being, because we can come together and laugh so much that our stomachs hurt, or we can think about like the ways in which we're really going to make a difference and change this world. If you're fighting for this kind of decolonial curriculum, it will be exhausting. And whatever institution or group of people you have to deal with, they will try to gaslight you, like your world experience is wrong. And they're going to tell you that this is not going to work. But I want to remind you that it has already worked, and that our dreams are the dreams that are going to be here in the future. We are the ones with the knowledges that we need to change this. And we know it's not supposed to be this way. We know the system should not be this way. We know it feels wrong. So now it's time for us to say we're the ones that can change it. Now, I didn't begin today with a land acknowledgement. Part of that is because the work I do, land acknowledgements talk about how I don't want land acknowledgements to be things that people use to excuse themselves for the hard work of decolonization. I want land acknowledgements to be real. So they can't just be something where we say, I acknowledge that people exist. Instead, they need to compel us toward action. And I think that this is how I want to end today. I want to first begin by letting you know that I'm coming to you from Baduat in Wiyot country in Northern California. And that with my land acknowledgement, I want to acknowledge the Wiyot peoples, the tribes that live in this region that are Wiyot tribe, Blue Lake Rancheria, and Bear River Rancheria. I want to say that they are still here, that they are still responsible for this land, and that they have been here for time immemorial. And this compels me to do the following. I'm going to share with you 2 links. I always think it's important as part of our land acknowledgement that if we are here in these spaces, that we do something. And I'm asking you today as people on this session, first, we are experiencing unprecedented fires in our region, and this means many people have lost everything. The first link is to a Facebook fundraiser for the people who have lost everything in the Slater fire in country. I would highly encourage you to donate anything that you can so that we can get supplies to the people in this region. Don't just acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are here, but help them in the times where they need help. The second link that I'm sharing is to give to the HSU Native American Studies Department, because we are right now designing and implementing a food sovereignty lab and cultural workshop space that was designed by our students and was proposed by our students to the administration. We need to raise at least $70,000 to make this happen. We're doing this food sovereignty lab in partnership with the Wiyot tribe, the Blue Lake Rancheria, and the Trinidad Rancheria, so that we can make this decolonized curriculum a part of what we teach at HSU, not just to HSU students, but to all students and young people in our region. If you donate, it will help us to show that there is support for this type of curriculum. If you cannot donate, I always tell people, pass along the links, send them to everyone you know. That's how you can do something today. And finally, if you donate, tag me on Twitter. I'm at Cutcha Baldy. I will share your donation. I will celebrate you. I will tell everybody about the action you took today so that you could participate in these decolonial methodologies. And I'll end by saying, which means thank you so much for these things, these good things that we're going to share today.